I guess it's a good news, bad news story that the Reporters Committee, which is a legal nonprofit, as Dick said, based in DC, now has almost 30 lawyers, making us one of the largest practice groups of media lawyers in the country. At any given time now, we have about 120 or 130 active cases on our docket, and they're all around the country. They're federal court, they're state court, some libel defense, some access, some public record, some subpoena defense, and everything is pro bono.
Blog Club Chicago is a nonprofit newsroom based in Chicago. We're committed to providing hyperlocal news. So what this looks like in practice is, reporters have different groups of neighborhoods in the city of Chicago that we cover day in and day out, bringing all sorts of local stories. We cover politics, we cover arts, we cover quirky things happening in the neighborhood. Obviously, when federal agents arrived to the city of Chicago for Operation Midway Blitz, this impacted many of the neighborhoods we cover. I cover neighborhoods in the southwest side of the city that are home to majority immigrant communities. I am an immigrant reporter covering immigration stories. And there was a real threat to immigrant reporters and frankly, any reporter when federal agents were using chemical agents and chemical weapons. Every time I was on the ground, and I was on the ground often, it was a situation where I was gathering pictures, video, talking to witnesses and sources, but also constantly monitoring for any changes in crowds or agents' behavior to prevent being detained, and wondering whether my immigration status could be used against me during my reporting.
Needless to say, the president's lawyers are frequent pen pals of mine, so they write to me, including on Christmas Eve when I got a visit from St. Lawyer, threatening to sue us over a story that said that Donald Trump didn't like exercise, something he admitted to 3 days later in the Wall Street Journal. So that sort of is the noise in the background. We were sued in 2020 by the Trump for President campaign over an op-ed written by the great Max Frankel, our retired editor, which is a case we won. We were then sued in 2021 by the president himself on a strange case where he claimed that our reporters had overborne the will of his niece to get confidential documents. He sued us for libel in Tampa, Florida, in the federal court there, over a couple of stories, one of which dealt with his time at The Apprentice, and one of which was sort of a compendium just before the election of some of the financial failings, legal problems, and other controversies he'd been involved in. That case is still pending.
And just to be clear, the president also has pending libel actions against, I know, the Wall Street Journal for disclosing the birthday note for Jeffrey Epstein, and he has a libel action pending against the Pulitzer Prize Board for the awarding of the Pulitzer Prize during his first term to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Does he have other pending? Am I missing anything?
BBC.
I'm sorry?
BBC.
Yeah. The BBC, right, sorry. And the BBC, as well as the actions that he settled. And just so people understand the broader context, in the sweep of American history from 1789 and the initiation of the presidency until 2017, no president had ever sued any no sitting president had ever sued any news organization for defamation.
When I said earlier that some of the broadcast companies have been reluctant to put their names on briefs, it's not because they're scared of losing licenses, really, right? It's that in an age of consolidation, which is the other thing Carr is doing, right, is that he's making it easier for the bigger to get bigger, for the mid-sized companies to sell. Favored players will get a prompt antitrust blessing. Those companies don't want to do anything that could put their M&A options at risk.
What the threat is. I think that just as the universities are finding, I think people in the news media are finding that there is a whole of government approach that's being used, that it's not one thing, it's all kinds of different things, whether that's the Federal Communications Commission going after ABC, whether that is the FTC going after Media Matters, or whether it's the EEOC bringing a case against the New York Times.
Hannah Nathanson was the lead reporter for a Washington Post project, actually, that won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service on Monday for its work on DOGE and other efforts to undermine, I think it would be fair to say, the structure of the federal government. On Christmas Eve of last year, the Washington Post published under her byline a story that detailed her personal involvement in talking to, I believe she said, over 100 sources, mostly on Signal on her phone. The government then raided her home and seized her electronic devices. The government still has her devices, and at the moment, the fight is between the government and the Post about the extent to which the government will be allowed to search the devices for information potentially relevant to the prosecution, or whether in the alternative the court will do its own search. And the judgment so far by, as Bruce indicated, both the magistrate and the district judge, is that the court is going to do the search and not allow the government to roam through the devices.
You know, when you see the White House and say that it's fake news and press is the enemy of the people and all of that, and then 5 days later you see FBI agents raiding a Post reporter's home, as Bruce referred to, those two things aren't unrelated. You know, if you are able to convince the public that the press are, that the journalists are bad actors, that they can't be trusted, that they don't have a role to play in democracy, that they're against America, it becomes much easier to do the kind of oppressive things that we have seen, including the raid.
I am optimistic that we're going to get through this, and that we may even have stronger precedent in some of the key constitutional First Amendment news gathering areas. And it is possible that 10 years from now, we look back and we decide that the most important case affecting the news media right now is New York Times versus OpenAI.
They were essentially training the models to know about language, and they were using it to make those models. And then those models did in fact have output that, as we show in our complaint, are in fact the expression of the New York Times.
Sometimes I would consume information from the New York Times and understand how ICE works, but not everybody who was deeply impacted by ICE operations understood that, because they don't have access to that information. So how do we bridge those gaps, and how do we really compete with influencers, content creators, or those who are just putting out misinformation and disinformation that at the time of Midway Blitz, it had real harms and it had real effects when people decided not to send their kids to school because they saw somewhere online that ICE was grabbing everybody. That has real consequences. So how do we as journalists bridge those gaps and really bring information and discern through the noise of content and AI generated content and news that are not news, and things that ChatGPT blurts out that are not really facts?
I do applaud the work that Bruce has done, and that Lawyers for Reporters has done, and the legal clinics have done, because for a lot of small news organizations, when they're being bullied, just having a lawyer who can respond can make a difference.
Please support local journalism, support your local news outlets. If you're in Chicago, you have family in Chicago, support Blog Club Chicago. You can subscribe, you can donate, you can share our stories, follow us on social media. And if you're not in Chicago, find your local news outlets. And there might be plenty. There might be, legacy media outlets, and there might be nonprofits, and there might be some that are doing some really innovative work. Find them, support them, donate to them, share their stories, amplify that work.
We would love to have some mentors for our younger lawyers, and just people who've been professionals and they've had interesting careers. And I think that the young lawyers really need and crave that kind of mentoring.
But beyond just local journalism, I'd say pay for some journalism. It's very simple.
When you're in conversations with your friends, your neighbors, your family, and people are attacking or questioning the press, I hope you will remind people that they too are Americans trying very hard to do an important job and hold this country together through a really difficult moment.
And finally, it is our privilege and civic duty to vote. And voting is going to make a huge difference for us in our future and for our freedoms, of which this is one of the most important.